Awesome. Thanks everyone for your patience. We're going to get started real quick. We have Tunnell here. Michael Tunnell is a Linux enthusiast for over 20 years and is a co-founder of the Tux Digital Network, where he hosts Destination Linux podcast, Hardware Addicts podcast, and This Week in Linux News show. During this talk, if you want to gain more users and grow your project, we're going to learn a little bit more about marketing. You'll learn tips and tricks for creating a marketing strategy. Every open source project can benefit from having a marketing strategy, but if you fail to market, then you're marketing to fail. Go ahead, Michael.
Than mine. Part of what you just said is what I'm going to say in a second. All right. Is it on? Okay, cool. So welcome everyone. In this talk, as you heard, you'll learn tips and tricks for creating marketing strategy for your project. My name is Michael Tunnell. I'm the founder of Tux Digital Network. I've been doing marketing in one way or another for many, many years now. So I felt like this would be a good opportunity to share some of my knowledge with everyone. But before we get started, for those unfamiliar with Tux Digital, it's a media network that has the goal of creating a network of content and also a community to promote Linux and open source. So we create podcasts, videos, and much more. We have many shows on the network. We have stuff like Hardware Addicts, Linux Out Loud, the Pseudo Show, and of course, Destination Linux, which I am on. Now, that's lesson number one. Shameless plugs are great. You can do them anytime, and they're effective. So lesson number two is you can always be marketing. Depending on what you're doing, you can take the opportunity to do it in various different ways. Whether you're talking to someone at a conference, in a web chat, or wearing a t-shirt promoting the podcast that you host. What a coincidence. I happen to be doing that. So if you want to stay up to date with what's going on in the Linux world, be sure to check out This Week in Linux, your weekly source for Linux news. Okay, enough plugs though. And I agree that this is going to be a topic that some people are going to find a little bit difficult to do, and that's fair because it is kind of difficult to do marketing. It's not necessarily hard to do, but there's going to be a lot to do, so just bear with me. And every open source project can benefit from having a marketing strategy, but not having one is actually kind of worse because there are so many opportunities that would be missed. And as you heard, if you fail to market, then you are marketing to fail. And marketing is more than just about promoting something. It's about how you do it. You can have the best marketing strategy as possible, and you can have all sorts of great stuff. But at the same time, if you execute it poorly, then it's just going to have very low effectiveness, or maybe none at all. So I'm going to give you some tips and tricks for improving your marketing efforts, and I'm going to give you examples of how these can help you. Now, let's address the elephant in the room first. As a marketer, I'll admit that marketing can be wielded both as like a source for good and so incredibly annoying that you want to drop kick your keyboard or your laptop out of a window, and that seems like a logical course of action at the time. So, fair enough. But this talk is going to help you be part of the first group. So marketing and advertising are also different things. Advertising is like a general concept of promoting anything in any context. So marketing is advertising with a purpose and a strategy. For example, Canonical decided to create this Ubuntu Summit and invited all of us to come here as well and streaming it to everyone else who couldn't make it. And I'm not saying that they were doing it for marketing purposes, but did I install Ubuntu or an Ubuntu flavor before I came here? Yes, I did. So there's some effectiveness there too. And marketing properly, like I said, is difficult. I'm not going to pretend it isn't a lot of work, but there is something that I want to clarify, and that is it's one of the most important things any project or company or developer or whatever can do to implement growth in their project. To put it another way, you can have the best software, the best product, the best service, whatever, but if no one knows it exists, then no one's going to use it. So marketing isn't simply promoting things, it's to help inform your target audience there's something to know about. So let's talk about the various methods, and there's a lot of different, I didn't keep up with that, did I? So there's a lot of different methods, and it would be impossible to cover them in 20 minutes, and it would be actually impossible to cover them in 5 hours, so I'm not even going to bother with that, but I'm sure there are some methods you're probably expecting me to cover, such as search engine marketing and social media, and that is something you should check out. You know, these are typical methods that are important, but we're not going to cover that in this talk, except for social media. I do want to briefly address that. If your project or company is not on social media, change that right after the talk. It's important. Now, which platform you use is very complicated and also incredibly easy to answer. Because it's complicated because the best platform depends on what you are marketing, and it's incredibly easy to answer because the answer is all of them. So there you go. Now, I know this sounds like a lot of work, and you're right, it is. So you can't do nothing about that. There's a lot of stuff to do. But there's going to be some things we're going to talk about specific to open source projects, and the first things we're going to talk about are blogs, press releases, and newsletters. So these are things that most projects already do or have done in the past, but there's a lot of nuance to it. For example, having a newsletter for the sake of having a newsletter, well, that's not great. You want to have some incentive for people to subscribe and keep subscribing. So that newsletter needs to do something of value. It can't be just announcements for your blog post. And if it is, then it's just duplicating the same effort. And if it's blog post, they could just go to the RSS feed and get the same thing. So for a newsletter, you can offer like behind the scenes stuff or info faster than your release cadence or whatever. It really doesn't matter as long as it's something special for that subscription. But blog posts are tricky because there's no wrong way or right way to make a blog post. They can be short, long, technical, casual, whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. You simply just need to do them and do them consistently. And it doesn't need to be like all the time. Maybe once a month, but something consistent. People know to expect it. Now, a great example of this is Nathan Graham of KDE, who creates the This Week in Linux. What? No, he doesn't. Creates the This Week in KDE blog post. There's a lot of technical stuff in there, but he keeps up to date with what's going on in the KDE community and tells you specifically with commits and everything, so it's really nice. And the GNOME project also do something similar with the This Week in GNOME. Did they take that name from my show? No, they didn't, because I took it from somebody else. Anyway. So now let's talk about press releases and release announcements. This is kind of a funny topic for me because practically every project does these, and most of them do it wrong, or at least in a way that is kind of defeating the point. So for example, I couldn't even begin to guess the amount of press releases that I've seen for a new product or a new feature for a software that didn't tell me exactly what that feature was, show a screenshot, a video, or anything, and then expect everybody to just load it up themselves to see it for themselves. You're basically setting up that particular post to fail. If you don't give them what to know what is happening, then they're not going to know. It also reminds me of like GitHub projects where they don't have anything like a screenshot or whatever, or even a README sometimes. Like, okay, what? It just defeats the point. But, you know, back to the point of the press releases, they're great, but they need to be treated as something incredibly important. Most of the time, they're just kind of, you know, done because they're expected to be done. But they should be one of the most important things you do, because, you know, I'll give you some behind-the-scenes stuff of how I do This Week in Linux. If a project doesn't bother to show me what is done in this latest release or a demo of it, then I'm probably not going to bother even including it, because then I have to do extra work that they should have already done. And if someone provides a video in it, then it makes it 1,000% more likely that I'm going to include it because then I have a nice fancy video to show. So think about that on your next update. Now, one form of marketing that open source projects tend to not put much emphasis on at all is their website. And this could be a variety of different things, but this is a very beneficial thing for your website and also a very detrimental thing if you don't do it right. So, let's say, for example, someone has a basic website that's just plain text, or it has the cliche of the black background and the green text. Don't do that. Have something that looks good and people will appreciate it because first impressions are important. And being on time and ready to go with your presentation is also important as a first presentation. Anyway, So, now, there's also other things you can do on your website. Like, for example, ask your users to create testimonials. And a lot of people think that this is kind of like curated information, but it is something that is effective, so I would highly suggest doing it. But probably the most important is to make it look good, because if you have a website that doesn't keep track with your slides, right, for example. Anyway, then you're going to have an issue of people leaving before they even give it a chance. And that's the main key about first impressions. If you don't give it a chance, you're basically telling your audience that they shouldn't either. So that's just the biggest thing. You should look at it as more of like a business card for your project, because that's how people look at it as well. Now, the next thing about your website I want to talk about, if the slides would work. They're not going to. That's fine. Yeah, but I'm not really sure where it is. Hey, there you go. Good documentation. Now, you might be thinking, why is documentation a part of marketing? Well, it can be, and it also shows your users that you put in the care and effort to have it, not just some random churn and burn script that you put together on a random Saturday afternoon during a commercial break of your soccer match or football match. Do football matches have commercials? I don't know. Anyway, they do? Okay, cool. So, okay, right, documentation. Why is documentation important? I want to give you an example of a solid form of marketing with documentation. And this is an interactive part. How many of you have used the Arch Wiki to fix something in your distro that is not Arch? That's a lot of people, right? Okay, so at least 70% in here did that. So there you go. Now let's talk about media marketing, because you now know that good documentation can go a long way. But media marketing is something that is not done often. And this one's going to be a little bit long. But let's talk about the YouTube video stuff and the podcasting. First up, YouTube videos. Every open source project should have a YouTube channel. Even if this is only to store the demonstrations that you put in your press release that I can then use. Just, reminder. Or if you want to make your YouTube channel even more useful, you can combine that with your good documentation and make video tutorials that will be even more helpful to your users and will make you look even better in terms of marketing and growth to your project. So if you want to go above and beyond, then that's how you do it. Do videos and documentation. So let's talk about podcasts. Podcasts are wonderful. They're a great way to market your project. And I don't mean creating your own podcast, because that's a lot of work to do. And if you're already doing a project, you don't really likely have time to do a podcast too. What I mean is to contact existing podcasts and try to do an interview with them. Now, of course, for example, you could be going on Destination Linux. We've had many people on for interviews, and we get reviews highlighting our interviews as saying that's one of the reasons why people listen. So the interesting thing about that is that you can get on these podcasts and get effectively free advertising to, depending on how large the podcast is, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people. It's an opportunity that a lot of people don't take advantage of. And also, we kind of seldomly get asked to have people on our show for interviews. We usually have to do the asking. I'm not complaining about that, though. I'm not trying to say like a help me, help you sort of thing. It's more of like, I guess I did kind of do that, though. But what I'm saying is that there is an ample opportunity to get on podcast and promote your project. Because waiting on me or Ryan or Jill to, ask you might take a while, because sometimes I just get distracted from something. Oh, right. So the other reason is that maybe I don't even know about the project and I wouldn't be able to ask in the first place. So in those cases, if you can basically jump the queue and just send an email and not even wait, if you're waiting for people to contact you, you might be waiting a long time, and it's just much better option to contact the podcast. And when I say podcast, I'm not saying just my podcast. I see my buddy from Linux Lads podcast in the crowd. There you go. And that reminds me to say that the other Linux podcasts out there, while they may be competition to me and to each other, they're not at all competition to you, and you should contact all of them and do an interview with all of them, because the more you're out there, the better, and the better likelihood that will help you grow. So, but of course, I will say that the tuxdigital.com podcast has the best podcast. And I'm not biased, by the way. This is 100% fact from scientific studies that I just made up. So do with that what you will. But to pivot from there, something you can also do is contact YouTubers in a similar sense of the podcasting stuff. And that's called influencer marketing. Sorry. I had a cringe effect from that term. So let's just move past that. But you can do the same thing with YouTubers. And I don't mean contact the biggest YouTuber you can find and ask them to talk about your stuff or do a review of your project or whatever. That is an option. You can do that. But there are other ways as well. For example, you can contact smaller channels and offer them something, or ask them to do a review, and they might be even more likely to do it because they appreciate you took the time to contact them, even though they're a smaller channel. For example, Ryan from Destination Linux, the co-host with me, he was sent a lifetime Plex Pass when he had very few views, and they just did it because they wanted him to cover it. And that is something he's mentioned in podcasts many times, and I'm mentioning it now. So it was effective just to do something like that. And the last thing I want to talk about, and is far from the least, it's arguably the best form of marketing ever made. I'm talking about in-person networking. All the banner ads in the cyberverse, if that's a thing, can never really replace just having a face-to-face conversation with someone. So conferences like this one are enormously valuable to attend in a variety of different ways. But even like just the random conversations in the hallways is worth it. So these kinds of things are very, very important. And the bonus tip is analytics. So technically this is not marketing, but I know a lot of people aren't really happy about analytics, but it is very, very useful to have. If you can track which types of marketing tactics are working, you can then lean into those marketing things. And that's basically in terms of like how marketers work. We have the techniques and the methods, and then that's 50% of what we do, and then there's analytics, and that's the other 50%. Because we always are making our decisions based on the reactions we're getting. So depending on how you want to do the analytics, or if you even do or not, that's up to you. But I do think you should, because there's a saying in marketing. It also, I guess it applies to life too. To know where you're going, you have to know where you've been. And this is why analytics are incredibly important. So do that. Now, thanks for coming to the talk, but we have plenty of time. Not really. But If you have any questions, we can do a quick Q&A. I think we got a few minutes, right?
Check, check. I can give you 2 minutes. You don't mute me. I can give you 1 minute now.
1 minute. All right.
I'm just kidding. I'll give you 2.
Rapid fire. Any questions?
Questions, folks.
Okay, back there.
There's a question back there.
Thank you for the talk. It's a super important topic. I just want to ask you, which project, open source project, of course, do you think is doing things right in terms of marketing that we could have a look to copy a bit what they're doing?
I think a lot of projects do one thing well and other things bad. So, there's different, like none of them do everything right because otherwise then, they'd be enormous. But one thing that I will say is that there are different examples of, for example, Zorin OS. Their website is fantastic, and it's a great first impression and that sort of thing. Also, Linux Mint is another example of a very terrible website for 13 years that then finally became a good website. That's very important. Then there's also, SUSE did some parody videos. Those are great until they weren't. So there's many different ways of doing marketing, and then people have been very successful, but also sometimes not so much. It just depends. And the thing that I see the most around marketing and open source is that there isn't any in most projects. I mean, 90% of projects do none of it. And maybe if they do some of it, they do the things that they were expected to do, but they barely do it. And even just contacting, doing press releases for websites like Phoronix or something would be definitely beneficial to do. And other things like contacting podcasts like my show for news, I have people who send me emails or Telegram messages or whatever to let me know that something happened, and then sometimes I use it, sometimes I don't. And that's another factor that you can do. You got a question?
Let's wait for the Elmo.
Oh,
Hi,
okay.
I just have a quick question. Being a little bit messy, if you had any examples of open source projects that are doing it wrong that we should avoid, but I think you already gave us a couple.
I can barely hear that.
How about now?
That's better.
Okay. So I had a little bit of a messy question that you already answered about open source projects who are doing it wrong that we could take a look at to see what we should avoid. And I also had a second part of the question for open source projects that you would say are marketing improperly. I guess this might be a little bit too general, but what would be a first step that you would recommend for that OS project to get more on track? And about how quickly would you estimate that they would see a difference, if that makes any sense?
So, I mean, unfortunately, it wasn't loud enough to hear half of your question. But in terms of like the, things doing it wrong, there are many examples. But my favorite example was the SUSE one, because their Uptime Funk parody video, if you've not seen it, is awesome. It is hilarious. It is super well done. And if you look at the one they've done latest, whichever one it is, I don't know, it is the opposite of that. So there you go. What was the other half of the question?
Any suggestions for open source projects that are going in the wrong direction?
Right. I heard that better without the microphone. I don't know. Yes, there are many, many suggestions. I'd have to kind of like do an audit of what they're doing to kind of, make it a clear thing to do. But the first thing is, if you don't have social media, get it. And I mean like all social media. You don't have to go to TikTok if you don't want to. But if you do, let's dance together afterwards and we'll do a TikTok. Anyway, but there's many different techniques, and probably the biggest one is social media, because you can connect with people easier because people already have those accounts. And if you want to do other things, I would say fix your press releases. I've seen projects like I said, not have anything that explains what the press release is. There's even sometimes releases on GitHub where it just says like the source file download and nothing. That's it. Like, put something and be as descriptive as possible. Because, okay, here's another, this is going to be actually useful for sure. Have your description be as in-depth and clear as possible, assuming the person is not a developer who is reading it, and because that's me, and I will talk about it easier if I know what it is, you know?
We're going to go with one last question from the Elmo.
Yeah, so that's not necessarily true because you can make a terrible video like those vertical things, you know what I'm saying? But the whole phrase about image is more helpful than words, that is true, and a video is way more helpful than images, absolutely true. But the thing about why this is important is because press releases are not for you to release your information. It's so that you can give it to press outlets and that they can take it and then modify it and promote it more. And if you make that difficult, they're not going to do it because they're already doing it for hundreds of other projects or software companies. And if you put any barrier to entry, they're not going to enter. And I'm not saying that I don't put any effort at all, but if I don't have to, it's very higher likelihood that I will include it. So, on my show at least. So that's it. Thanks again for coming to the talk. If anyone has any further questions, feel free to ask me afterwards. And those who are watching the live stream, you can go to forum.tuxdigital.com to contact me if you spell it correctly, not like that. So that's all the time I have. Thanks for coming to the talk. And be sure to like and subscribe. What?
Okay, no more shameless plugs.
No,
Mute him.
That's a YouTube. That's not on purpose. Okay. Thanks. Sorry.